everybody's in this all together kind of thing. It's the idea, whether it's the idea that leaders eat last, or that everybody shares in the hardship, like that's really what it was all about.
Welcome back to the Northern Sentinels podcast. On this episode, I sit down with Alastair Luft. Al grew up on the family farm in Alberta, where hard work and contributing to something bigger than yourself was part of everyday life. After a brief stop at a civilian university, he decided to join the Army and quickly felt a sense of purpose in his new profession. After graduating from military college and a brief stop in an Austrian prison, he found himself in Afghanistan with Canada's first mission after 9/11. As a young platoon commander on the forward edge of a new war, he experienced firsthand the challenges of leading Canadians in a combat zone. A U.S. fighter pilot mistook his platoon for enemy and dropped a 500-pound bomb on their night training activity. 4 of his soldiers were killed and many more wounded in the tragedy. He completed 4 more deployments to Afghanistan with our Special Operations Forces Command, but eventually decided to leave the high tempo of operations for a more balanced life. This is when he found a love of creative writing. An author of 4 books, Alastair's latest offering is called The Spark, a no-holds-barred guide to saving the world. As a listener of the NSP, I can assure you, The Spark will be something you enjoy reading. Without further ado, my conversation with Alastair Luft. Hey, Alastair, great to have the chance to talk to you today. And before we get things started, I do have to do a quick pitch right at the start and to say I absolutely love the work you're doing with The Spark. It's great. And we've spoken about this a little bit before, and we could certainly spend this and probably a couple of more episodes talking about that and the work you've done in terms of that effort. So I just wanted to plug that right at the start because I really enjoy reading it.
Yeah, well, I appreciate, I appreciate being invited to come in to talk, and obviously for The Spark. A lot of work has gone into that. So it's nice to see it having some resonance, and, obviously I can talk about that as well, whenever and for as long as anyone wants to talk about it, probably.
Yeah, I think we'll certainly get to that towards the end because it's a natural sort of flow of the story is that, where The Spark is and this stage of your life. But perhaps we go back to the beginning and give us a bit of a sense of the Luft family beginnings and where it all started.
Yeah, so I grew up on a farm in Alberta, just outside of Calgary. Very different than what it looks like right now, and on gravel roads and not too far. Our nearest neighbor being about a mile away. Kind of time to ourselves on the farm, just doing chores or just occupying ourselves. People joke around about the 80s or the Generation X these days about how they were kind of kicked outside and told, we'll see you at supper or whatever like that. But that was really what it was kind of like for me growing up on a farm was, obviously with chores and stuff, but yeah, like keep yourself occupied and we'll see you when it's time, for a meal or when something's happening.
Yeah, I told my daughter the same sort of thing about when I was a kid in Cold Lake and my dad was at the base there about how the sun would come up, you get on your bike, and then you just sort of disappear until supper time, and maybe you had a little bit of money in your pocket to get something somewhere, or maybe not.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's very foreign today.
Yeah. And I was having this conversation with my daughters, actually, just about some of the stuff I had done because there was I wasn't being supervised. And it was just that freedom to kind of make mistakes a little bit, even though looking back now, some of the consequences of those mistakes, could have been, pretty grievous harm to a certain extent, but, none of that happened. And it's just that freedom to explore, and just, do trial and error on your own. It was very, liberating, I guess now. Hindsight is always great, but, yeah, it was good.
Yeah, I like to think of us as a little bit of the lawn dart generation.
Yeah.
We all survived that backyard game.
Yeah.
So the Luft family, what's the background? Where did your family, come from originally, and were they always in Alberta?
So my family on my dad's side are what's called Volga Germans, I guess. We've read a few studies about it. So what those were basically in the 1800s, Russia was trying to entice people to come and settle the western part of the country, and so had enticed a lot of Germans to move to the western part of the country. So my family, through many years or many generations ago, were part of those was part of that group that had moved to Russia, and were granted very much rights or whatever. They could have their own farms or their own collectives and not have to serve in the Russian army, not have to pay taxes, etc., to get them to go. As time went by, some of those rights were eroded to a certain extent. So the right not to have to serve in the Russian army was being taken away, and that also coincided with the settlements. So we're talking about later in the 1800s now, coming up on the 1900s. That was also, part of the time of mass settling in North America. And so through a confluence of factors, my family would have moved from the part they had settled in Russia and came across to North America. Whether or not they settled first, there is some different accounts about whether or not they, people settled in in the United States or Canada first. To the best of my knowledge, my family always always lived in Alberta, and it's all the names in my hometown or the home area where we're at, the farming community, is very Germanic. Like we've got Luft, which in German would have had an E on the end, and Luft, I always get that, it means air. But there's lots of like Hegels and Schmaltzes, Paffenross. It's very, in the area where I grew up, it's a very German area, just because it was very similar stories for most of the people who settled there. So my mom is from Scotland. So she's a Canadian now. She came to Canada. Actually, what had happened was that my dad was married before my mom. So he had a first wife, and then he had 4 kids, and then she died in a car accident. And my dad's first wife was related to my mom through a couple a couple distant cousins. There's a grandmother back in Scotland, great grandmother, I think, of ours, Grandma Cunningham, who had like 10 or 13 kids or whatever. So a quite wide network. Anyways, my mom was actually on not a post school trip, but was basically, taking an opportunity to travel the world a little bit, and was in Quebec actually working for a summer when my dad's first wife died. And because they were connected through family, they reached out and, basically asked my mom if she'd be willing to go to Alberta to help my dad, raise these 4 kids as a male farmer. And he's very much, my dad was born in 1930, so very much a different kind of generation.
Right.
So, the family kind of pulled strings behind the scenes, and my mom went to Alberta to help him sort of raise these kids. And then one thing led to another, and, like, to make a long story short, they eventually got married, and she decided to stay in Alberta and try life for size on a farm. Yeah.
So was that her first exposure to living on a farm, to that sort of rural environment?
Yeah, very much. The area where they lived in Scotland was, not a city, but certainly not, and they had like, a property outside of a town. So they had some land to themselves, but not a farm. And, going back to even what Alberta was like when I grew up, still with gravel roads, but this, project even farther back. So her mother-in-law, was, born 1910 or 1905, had grown up, lived through the Depression, lived through the age where farms had to be largely self-sufficient. It had lived through the era when threshing crews would come through the countryside, and, for a period of a week or so, she would just have this massive kitchen going, feeding threshing crews as they worked from farm to farm. So now all of a sudden my mom, coming from, Scotland and, where she had grown up, with their dad's garage and things, and now transplanted to this farm in Alberta where there's no one really nearby. And these expectations, of just hard, sort of like settlers, working the land and being self-sufficient on a farm. And I know it was a bit of a culture shock for her. But she persevered. She persevered through it. And I think one of the things she found, and I think still to this day, is working with animals has been one of the most rewarding things in her life. Her mom was a vet, one of the first women vets in Scotland, actually. And so working with animals has been just like a phenomenal thing for her, I think, a highlight of her life.
I wonder if that was one of the things that she looked at when she was sort of making this decision of saying, oh, but you know what? I really like animals as well. So there's another outlet here that I get to explore. That's kind of neat.
Yeah. It's interesting. Like I haven't actually had that many conversations with her about her decision making or what it was that sort of tipped it for her. Yeah. Like what was it that what was the tipping point for her that made her decide to go? And the relationship I had with my dad, he was quite a bit older than me when I was born. So he would have been 48, I think, when I was born. And very much, he worked a lot on a farm and also having his own business. And, that was, so we didn't see, I didn't see a lot of him. And it was only, recently, since I moved away that we actually started to have like real conversations, I think, about, what he was thinking and certain things that happened when he was younger. And right up until, well, he died this past summer, and it was right up until, he passed that we were having conversations about what things were like for him, when he was 20 or so. So all that to say, I don't know a lot about, how they came to fall in love, or the things they did, because, it's always hard to imagine your parents being young, or so I've heard, right? And it's just like I don't know really what it was that did that for them. So yeah, but it's interesting.
So you were born and raised on this family farm that had been in the family for generations. Yeah,
I don't know exactly. Like I don't know the precise year when our family settled it, but certainly as far as I can remember, it's been on our family for over 100 years, definitely. Yeah. And my dad lived there his entire life. Like he died, he was 93, turning 94, and he had lived on that farm his entire life. So yeah, quite a bit a lot of history there.
And what was life like as a farm kid growing up in Alberta?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think looking back on it now, it seems, like we did chores often, and we were pretty isolated in terms of, we lived a couple miles or kilometers away from people, and it was school. But I remember it being like a lot of fun. Like there was hard work, definitely. But also, having a lot of time to just, to play or do our own things, and being outside a lot. A lot of things with animals, obviously, but also riding bikes. Like it was good. I'd say we weren't, the cliche about farmers is they're not money rich, but, have a lot of things in other, we always had enough food. We always had enough, like clothes are always super comfortable, with everything that we had. Were we rolling in money? Absolutely not. But that was never something that really occurred to me or really bothered me. It was good. Yeah.
What are some of the values that you learned from a rural childhood, and do you think those are continue to be relevant today, or do you ever feel that your kind of view of the world shaped by your childhood may be a little antiquated at all?
Yeah, it's I was thinking about this, and it's hindsight is sometimes obviously, as they say, 20/20 or whatever. But one of the things on the farm, I think that I learned certainly is the value. Well, is that the work never ends, and associated with that is hard work. And I was tied that into a little bit. I think. Well, sorry. Just so on that thought itself of the work never ending, and I think that does have value still today, because because here's, I think, the reference is that often it's easy to fall into, what could be called a milestone mindset. If I just do this, that's going to be enough for me. If I'm just able to get promoted to the next rank, I'll have made it. If I'm just able to earn a certain amount of money, or whatever it is. Like I read an article this morning. If I was just able to have a partner or whatever, I would be happy or whatever like that. But the thing is, like on a farm, the work is never done. Like no matter what milestones you have, it's seasonal. There's something that's going to come more for it. And I think that that's really valuable, because the reality is, when you live that milestone mindset that there's always one more thing, well, you never reach your destination, and you live in this perpetual mindset that, you can't enjoy the present moment because there's always something missing. Understanding, that there's certain things you don't control. And no matter how hard you try to change that, you can't control it. And that's really especially pertinent in a country like ours, right? Like in the wintertime, it's going to snow. And no matter how hard you on a farm, no matter how hard you try to fight that, you're not changing that. So, you can either tilt at that windmill, or you can, adapt to that particular circumstance. And I think that principle ends up being something that is pertinent in everybody's life right now. It's just a question of applying it to your specific circumstance. What are those things that you don't control, no matter how hard you try to do it, but are still going to impact you regardless? And then, how do you interact with that situation in a way where you're not, beating your head against the wall, but it's a way that's productive and you're able to, be relevant to that situation and interact with it in a way that's positive, as opposed to obstructionist and is going to prevent you from, getting the most out of that moment that you can. It seems like it's very esoteric, from in the fall we harvest. But I think the principle is still there. Like that is super pertinent for today, for any time really. And there's one other thing I think which is relevant, and it's tied into that a little bit, which is this idea of like on a farm and self-sufficiency to a certain extent. There's a concept which I understand from a martial concept, which is, if I'm pronouncing it correctly in Japanese, it would be Banpen Fugyo, which loosely translated, I think, means 10,000 changes, no surprises. And part of that idea would be that, life is a matter of change. Life is not static. In fact, you could argue from a certain point of view that once you become static, you've already started to die, basically, right? Because life is constantly changing. So it's not a question of, in interacting with life or survival or persistence or whatever, it's not a question so much of, like getting that one, from a martial perspective, getting that one capability or that one technique, which is going to be your go-to one. Because what happens, and we know this in a defense perspective, is that we build a capability and then our adversary builds a counter capability. And then it's this continual interplay where we have to continue evolving. And the minute you stop evolving, you're irrelevant. So there's always going to be some sort of change, but it's how you can like adapt to change and be open to change. And that's the no surprise part, where it's this resilience and flexibility. And that's, again, that's something with a farm as well too, because there's going to be a year where you're going to get a drought, or there's going to be a year where hail wipes out your crop, so how do you adapt to those changes, no surprises, which is, through resilience. And then, so you see these farms that, have backups, farmers, certainly from my own frame of reference, my dad had a second job in a company as an offset against risk. So if the cattle prices weren't doing well, he's not, all his eggs are in one basket. Right. And that's, I think, again, maybe it's a bit of a tenuous link to this idea of, 10,000 changes, no surprises. But I do think that was in play without me knowing it. And then being able to look back now, you can see that thread existing. And I think that's a really relevant idea today as well, because as we know, changes are happening all the time, and it's very difficult to stay resilient in the face of some of these changes that are happening. And a lot of the trends would suggest that the consequences of certain things, whether that's climate change or economic turmoil or geopolitical conflict, will potentially become more severe, particularly as they're all interrelated. So it's how do we make ourselves resilient in the face of that, in the face of those changes, so that we're not surprised. Not literally, because there will be some things that surprise, but that those surprises aren't, critical shocks or critical, failures that cause us to not be able to function anymore.
I mean, that's a great rundown, and I like how you connected all those things in terms of whether it be getting the most out of the moment to all the way to sort of dealing with adversity. And I don't know where I heard it, but one of the things that I often say to people is, the boat is always leaking, right? There's always going to be a problem. It could be a small problem. It could be a big problem. So just be comfortable and be at peace with the fact that if there's a time when there's something that's not going wrong, that's great. But the problem is around the corner, and that shouldn't be a surprise, and that shouldn't be a huge dislocation. You just accept the fact that things are generally going to go wrong, and as you said, life is not static.
Yeah.
Life is very dynamic.
Sorry, I think there was just one other thing that occurred to me as well too, was that I think and again, this is with the benefit of having some time to think about it, but it's the idea. I can't remember who it was that said, whether it was one of the Roosevelts or not, but the idea that things that are achieved too easily are valued too lightly. And there's something to be said for, I want to use the word suffering a little bit, but I don't know that it's the right word, because I would hesitate to say that anything that I did on the farm was truly suffering compared to, a lot of the circumstances that people find themselves in. But certainly I was uncomfortable at times. Those were often, and whether that's like, feeding the animals at minus 40 or something like that, or because they still need to be fed. But often it's those long periods of discomfort working at something that really make you value, something that you did at the end of it, something that you achieved. And my dad perhaps had more of those experiences because he literally rode a horse to school, maybe not uphill both ways, but, certainly had that hard work, and achieved, things that I think us today looking back at might say, wow, God, how did they do that? Because it's so foreign to us. But I think you learn that value of, sweating, like an ounce of, a pound of sweat or is worth is better than an ounce of blood kind of thing. Like, absolutely. The value of hard work towards accomplishing something, I think, makes you really value when you do achieve something, as opposed to, well, I'm just going to go down to the store and just buy that. And, like your skin in the game is not much in those types of circumstances. And I think there's something very, really valuable in that as well.
So when you were growing up, was there a point at which you had a clear understanding or a clear sense of what you wanted to do after high school in the future?
No. I wish there was. My wife knew that she wanted to be a teacher, specifically a French teacher, I think as far back as when she was in grade 3. And for me, it just wasn't, I don't even think I can pretend that I had a good idea about what I wanted to do. And it feels when I look back on it, it feels like I almost fell into different things. Because I don't think I had even considered a career in the military, or not necessarily a career, but joining the military until close to graduating. And it was more like, for me, joining the military was more a case of finding a way to pay for education. And by the way, it looked like it was going to be maybe not fun, but certainly some enjoyable things and some new things that I had never tried before. But yeah, I don't remember having a firm idea this is definitely what I want to do, or this is the particular field that I want to go in. That wasn't something that I had. It was just seeing what options I had and then seeing which ones I tended to enjoy or I stuck with.
Was there any examples of service in your family?
On my mother's side, there was quite a bit in terms of military service. So her dad and a number of her uncles and family members had all served in World War II. Yeah, my grandfather actually had a story where he was captured by Rommel. We hear these. He was a mechanic in North Africa or in Africa, and you hear these stories about Rommel and the Africa Corps roaring around so quickly and just doing random random things. And apparently, so the story he told us goes is that Rommel's headquarters was rolling around and captured this British. I don't know if it was a convoy or anyways, this unit, and basically said, hey, we captured you, but we have nobody to watch you, so stay here, and then a German unit will be here to collect you shortly, and then took off because he was trying to command the entire battle in Africa. And of course, they didn't stay there; they left and were able to return to their lines. But yeah, so there was a big history of military service, anyways, on my mom's side. On my dad's side. Definitely no military service. And in fact, I think that there was a negative attitude towards the military. Just a little bit, I mentioned earlier about the experience in Russia, and certainly the Russian army didn't have a great reputation for treating its people all that well. And so there was a little bit of, I think, not maybe, I don't want to say outright distrust or a negativity, but certainly not like a willingness to go off and join the army, and that didn't exist on my dad's side. But there was a lot of community service through my dad. So my dad was, heavily invested in the Lions and other sorts of community organizations. There was a group called Pioneer Acres. It was really dedicated to reminding people about what it was like as a pioneer in the West. So he was involved in a lot of organizations like that. And I know my grandparents were really involved in their church and different types of community events through there. So there was, from a broader perspective, absolutely there was a tradition of service there. And then on my mom's side, very clearly military service through World War II.
And what did your parents think when you decided you were going to join the military?
Yeah, so by way of context, my dad had wanted to join the RCMP, and his parents prevented him because he was a single boy, and the expectation was that he was going to take over the farm. And that always stuck with him. And I think he really made an effort to not say one way or the other for his kids what they did with their lives. So he didn't, both of my parents were always very supportive in general about what, any of the kids wanted to do with their lives and what to pursue. So they were, supportive of joining the military from that context. I know that, from another context, they weren't thrilled about the idea also. Like I know, and this is, I think, a testament in my dad's case that, that's not and he mentioned this to me, that it's not the career he would have picked for me. Because I think he had actually been in cadets from what he told me, and it wasn't like a great experience for him, but I know he told me it wouldn't have been the career that he would have picked for me, but he never told me that until, after I had joined and I had been enlisted for several years. Outwardly they were very supportive and very, very much so. My mom was also very supportive as well, too, of it. I think it's the natural concern that people have when there's their offspring or their loved ones join something like the military, especially if there's not a real tradition or familiarity with what the organization does or what's entailed. Because, certainly at that time as well, tail end of the Cold War, and it wasn't so, well, not when I joined, obviously, but, when I was born, but, that frame of reference for militaries was still more, like militaries fight and soldiers die. And, that can be, that's tough to then have your child go off and join that organization, because obviously as a parent, you worry about the worst case scenario, and that's clearly one of them. But yeah, outwardly, my parents didn't communicate any of that stuff to me, and were just very supportive of me joining.
And what was your initial experience like in the military? What did the first few years look like for you?
Yeah, it was really eye-opening. It was a real shock for me. part of me really enjoyed it because, well, I mean, as a 18, 19-year-old, and I was in good shape, and I really enjoyed the physical challenge. And, to be honest, like it provided a lot of purpose for me, particularly, and I think I'm not so sure that occurred during basic training. Basic training was good. I enjoyed the physical challenges, but I think it was really at RMC that I really started to see the value of military service, and the military ethos and the values and the things that in an ideal world that we like the profession of arms to stand for. And as a profession, I think, certainly at RMC, that would have been the first time that it would have been exposed to me that the military is it's not just a bunch of, people putting on uniforms and going off to battle or whatever. It's a profession, and a profession has standards. And our profession in particular has unique circumstances that, whether that's universality of service or unlimited liability. And that I think there was a number of aspects that really appealed to it. And I could say, earlier on, I mentioned that I didn't really know what I wanted to do with my life after school. And I could say that, when that realization came, and I don't know when it was exactly, but certainly within those first couple of years, that provided me with purpose that, to that point, I don't think I'd realized was really lacking in my life. And from that point on, I was really, what do we call us, like a true believer or not? But yeah, I really believed in the value of the profession and the what it offers society. And I still believe that. I don't want to imply that I don't. My views now are maybe slightly more nuanced in terms of where the military fits in the broader scheme of things. But yeah, I think I really enjoyed my first few years in the military because it was a purpose that I didn't have before.
That realization of a sense of purpose, did that come about organically, or did you have mentors along the way in those early years at Royal Military College that, whether by their example or actually by sort of directly having a conversation about the profession, the purpose, that instilled that in you? How did that sort of come about?
Well, that's a great question. Well, I mean, certainly there's an education component to it, right? Which was the normal 4 pillars at RMC, where that's a component of it in professional education. I certainly had a number of role models at RMC. So one of them, I was fortunate enough to be on the Sandhurst team at RMC, or the military skills competition, which takes place at West Point, where RMC sends a team to compete. One of the first, I think there was one year, I was on the second and third, maybe fourth year that we competed in it as well. So there was a sergeant at RMC, and when I was there weren't very many NCOs that were at RMC. So it was difficult to get that level of, mentoring or role modelship. But we had a sergeant who was assigned to our team from the RCR, Ken Taylor, I believe his name was. And I think, we didn't have a specific conversation in terms of like mentorship, but it was a very much learn, by observing. And, I would say he was a great role model because would show us, some of the military skills, he would obviously demonstrate for us, like strip and assemble a C9. And I think, that's where I started to see the value of practice, like do it again. How can I make it better? How can I get quicker? How can I arrange the parts and the components of the weapon system so that it's more natural to do it? And it's this idea, of being continuously trying to improve yourself at your craft and your trade. Knowing, perfection is probably an unattainable goal, but how close can we get to it? And those were certainly some of the things that I saw from Sergeant Taylor is how can we shave a couple seconds off the wall climb, or what are the different things that we can do on our techniques to get better, and constantly pushing ourselves to get better. Did I have like an actual, I don't know that I had an actual mentor like someone who took me under their wing, sort of offered ongoing insights on it. This is to, post Somalia time. So, we were certainly, absorbing some of the lessons as they were being rolled out. But I don't think at that time, if I remember correctly, we didn't have a formal, program or it hadn't formally been made its way through the curriculum yet. So it was more one-off instances. There were opportunities there for individual or ad hoc mentorship, but not like a dedicated relationship with a person or a couple different people to guide me. I mean, later on in my career, I was able to have a little bit more of a formal or at least consistent mentoring. And certainly, my opportunity to work with Mike Day in CANSOFCOM, through a number of years, was wonderful in terms of the mentorship that he provided. And I don't know, in terms of his bandwidth, how much effort he devoted to it. But I do remember him, I occasionally having chats about this in terms of, division of time, from his perspective, the time that would be spent on his actual work versus, time that would be set aside exactly for mentorship types of activities. And not just on me, but on the group of individuals that he would have been mentoring or would have been guiding at certain points in their career. And it was, like a quarter of his time kind of thing spent on that one specific thing. And it's very, I think humbling at that point to think, I think that might have been one of the, not first exposures potentially, but ones that certainly stuck with me in terms of this is important as well. Guiding and shepherding the next generation of, I don't want to say leaders, but, the next generation of people who are going to follow in our footsteps. And we can't expect them to, I think the goal that we all want to shoot for is that people who follow us are better than us.
So I want to jump to, your time in the regular Army and your time with 3VP, and specifically, to talk through your time in Kandahar, because I think that's probably a pretty important experience in your life, and I'm not sure, especially as time marches on, I'm not sure how many people are still sort of aware of not only that mission broadly, but then the Tarnak Farms specifically. So maybe give us a bit of a sense of that mission and some of the events that unfolded in there.
I'll start maybe not quite at the beginning, but because it's for me. So I got to battalion. When I got to battalion, this was in summer of 2000. 3VP had just come back from Bosnia, and on quite a this was a tail end of some of the peacekeeping. Well, not the tail end because they continued to go for a while, but certainly the mid 90s peacekeeping tours had evolved to something a little bit more stable. So at the time when I got to battalion, there was discussion about the light battalions being, I can't remember the exact word, whether it was rationalized or downsized, but
yep.
And so there was a real expectation that the 3rd Battalion was going to become not the 3rd Battalion anymore. And what I mean by that, I guess, is there was a fair number of or former airborne soldiers that were in 3VP, and there was a real commitment to, dismounted infantry and this type of light infantry soldiering that exists. And I think there was a big fear that, what people were being told was that wasn't important, or that wasn't a priority, and that it was going to go away. And there was a real, apprehension and tension and dissatisfaction, I think, with some of that stuff. So on the one hand, it was not quite what I expected when I got to battalion. We were doing exercises and like 2 platoons per company, and within each platoon, you'd have like 10 or 15 people or whatever. So you just, like, we did a bridge demolition guard. I think in the first winter I was there, I had 12 people, and I couldn't even do all the tasks that were being assigned to me, even if everyone was up 24/7. And it was to the point, and it's tough, like being being the new officer there with guys that had been around for a while and had kind of seen seen a number of workup trainings and a number of different things going, like what are we doing here? And trying to maintain positivity in the face of people saying like, this isn't a real, like we have so few people that there's really not even any point doing this. So that was tough, but on the same time as well too, it was really rewarding to be in battalion and just actually do the business, because the other thing we were able to do was just experiment. And just when we were on exercise, like, there wasn't a total tension of like, hey, this is your one chance to do a platoon attack, so you better get it right. It was like, okay, nothing about this is standard, so let's try it and see what works and do something. So actually we had an opportunity to really experiment, with making it work with small numbers. And
was that something you took on yourself, or was this something that the battalion just looked at and went, well, it's less than ideal, so it's a great time to experiment?
Yeah, so I don't even think that was a conscious a conscious thing. It's like, hey, we're doing this workup training or this exercise or whatever anyways, and it just happened to turn out, I think, that, well, there's no way we can do this by doctrine or by normally, so let's figure out the best that we can make of the situation. I mean, 3VP was very can-do in that respect. It was like, well, we can't, that's not going to work, so what can we do that is going to work, and then try to make that happen. When 9/11 happened, I just got out of jail. Yeah, so when through one circumstance or another, we had gone to Austria on a Partnership for Peace exercise. It was supposed to be a bit of a good go, I guess, for me, having just come back off phase 4. And then, getting to know the people in my platoon, Sergeant Lauren Ford took me under his wing, took me to some bars. Anyways, I wasn't able to control my drinking and ended up getting in a fight. Ended up getting arrested by the Austrian police and resisting arrest and spending the weekend in jail. Got out of jail, I think, on September 10th, 2001, and then was being sent home, and 9/11 happened, and then was stuck in Austria for a week while all the airports were shut down. So
yeah, the world stopped flying.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And then when I got back to battalion, so through a roundabout way, I had a detour through area headquarters while Colonel Stogren, who was our CO at the time, and the brigade commander kind of figured out what the hell to do with me. But that obviously had bigger fish to fry, considering 9/11 had just happened. So definitely,
Lieutenant Luft was not the top of the list. No.
Yeah, definitely not a priority. So that's totally fine. It was understandable. So I cooled my heels for a while, and then when I got back to battalion, though, it was actually really good. And what it was good, I think, was that I took a lot of flack, obviously, for it, and it was great because like the section commanders were saying like, oh, don't look out, he was going to give you a left and a right, and then there's tons of joking about it. But I think I do remember my platoon warden at the time, Kevin Tal, kind of took me aside at one point and said, like, one of the reasons it's good that you went through that experience is he's like, next time when you have a private or a corporal that's going to come up and got drunk over the weekend, in the bar, and has to appear in court or whatever like that, he's like, you're going to know what that guy went through. So it's relatable to a certain extent, and that ended up being why it was good. I think was that it ended up being a way for me to actually relate with the people that I was working with, particularly in my platoon. And we had a great rapport, I think, certainly between myself, my platoon warrant, the 3 section commanders, the weapons det, and, the people I work with, on a more close basis. Not to say that was with everybody in the platoon, but certainly the majority of people there, like we were really tight and a really close platoon. And part of that was the uniqueness of the circumstance as well, working up for Op Apollo. The battalion went from, and we weren't going to be disbanded, I don't think, but we went from a circumstance where we thought we were going to be disbanded to all of a sudden we're going to Afghanistan. And like, I don't want to look back with, the wrong impression or whatever. But certainly when Afghanistan kicked off, it certainly was one of those moments in time where it was like you knew that the world was one thing up until a certain point in time, and then an event happened and it was something different afterwards. And none of us knew what we were getting into in Afghanistan. We'd heard about the Taliban, but did we think we were going to war? I don't know about that. Certainly we thought that it was far different from a peacekeeping mission, and that there would be a chance that we would go off and get in combat and that some of us wouldn't come back. Absolutely. We thought that. And that created what that did actually was create a real urgency to make sure that we were not as good, but as prepared for that situation as we could, to the point, we determined that a few people weren't gelling well with the platoon, and we were able to, move them somewhere else and replace them, so that the group that we had were the people that we really wanted to go to war with. And that was really empowering. It was really empowering to be entrusted with those types of decisions about, our own frame of reference. And that carried through right into, the early days in Afghanistan. Our first, so there was a long period of waiting to go to Afghanistan. Like we were constantly, I think we drove to Edmonton Airport almost like 3 times, I think, to get on a plane, and we kept getting like bumped. It lasted over Christmas. But when we finally got there, it was really surreal. Just because there was nothing, a lot of people who served in Kandahar airfield or in Kandahar in general, I guess later on, will remember, the boardwalk and, all the amenities that existed there in the sewage lagoon. But when we first showed up, there was nothing. We showed up and, we got off the plane, and there was the old terminal that existed there. And that's, there was a bunch of temporary huts that were sort of set up there where I think it would have been the Rakistans, I think, that were in charge then, where they had their kind of brigade headquarters. And then we were led to, some tents before we did our relief in place on the line. And then I think like the next day we did a recce of the lines, and then we brought everybody out and did a relief in place with it was like a transport platoon that was on the line. And we didn't get like the handover wasn't as good as it necessarily could have been, but we were basically told like, here's the trenches, or they were more like there were bunkers, and then like everything forward of those bunkers has been mined. So stick to the track plan, and then we were just stuck in these bunkers on the line. And then in the platoon admin area, these were the days, like there were no even porta potties. So there were tubes in the ground, and that's where you pissed. And then there was drums, the 5-gallon drums that were cut in half and filled with diesel and had like a board put over them with a hole in it. And that's where if you had to shit, that's where you went. And then, so we had the burning details. And, that was a routine thing. Everybody took part in all of that stuff. So it was a really good bonding experience. And 3VP was really good in terms of, everybody's in this all together kind of thing. It's the idea, whether it's the idea that leaders eat last, or that everybody shares in the hardship, like that's really what it was all about. I took my turn on a shit burning detail, no different than anybody else. Did I do it as often? Probably not. But we still took part in all that stuff, and we shared the hardships with everybody.
The line, was this sort of an all around defense, like a ring, or was it face? It was.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So for listeners, Kandahar Airfield was, 50 kilometers east of Kandahar City, sort of just in the middle of a plain. Yeah, kind of like east, southeast, along number 4. So number 4 highway going down to Spin Boldak. It was sort of sits between Kandahar City and the Pakistan border.
100%. Yeah. And so, it was just I think there was 2 battalions, if I'm not mistaken. When we first took the line, there was 2 battalions worth of, I don't know. Certainly 3VP was on the line. I don't know what the other battalion was, whether it was an infantry battalion or not, but that was the defense. And it was classic Phase 3 infantry in the defense. We did morning and, stand twos at first light and the last light. Once a week, we stood 2 while we cleaned the section weapons or the platoon weapons. Very classic. And so to a certain extent, and I remember having that discussion, on phase 3, you're in the defense and you're like, well, what am I ever going to use? What am I ever going to be in, in the defense? And then here we are actually doing it. And we did defensive routine for about 3 or 4 weeks. And it was, it's not the funnest thing to do, but it was actually on the same hand, and it was great. Maintaining, positivity. And, there was one night where we got a report that the Taliban had a BM-21. So a Soviet era multiple rocket launcher with a range of like 21 or 25 kilometers, I think. So this thing was evidently roaring around out there, and all of a sudden backhoes showed up. And, in addition to these bunkers, we had trenches being dug everywhere. And it was just like, there's a degree of, hey, this is realness to it. But at the same time, it's like, hey, this is actually our job. Like, let's, this is for real. And it was really, it was exciting. It was very exciting. And everybody had a really positive attitude as best we could towards it.
So what is Tarnak Farms?
So Tarnak Farms was literally, it's just south of where Kandahar Airfield is, and it was a built-up area compound where previous to the the invasion of Afghanistan, where Al Qaeda had set up, and the rumor is that Al Qaeda had set up like a chem facility there, or a chemical facility there. I don't think that proved to be true or whatever, but certainly it had been, a base of operations for Al Qaeda within Afghanistan as a training ground for training Al Qaeda fighters. Anyways, that had, obviously the Al Qaeda and Taliban fled the area, and Tarnak Farms fell into the possession of, the Allied force or Western forces. What it became was a training ground for us, really. And it was unclear. I don't want to say that it was mined, but certainly there was ordnance, or it hadn't been cleared. So we had to assume that, it was a potential danger area. So there were certain portions of it that once cleared became a training ground for us. Because, even, when you're in a situation where you expect to be in combat, there's still value in training, right? Like whether it's sighting in your weapons or, one thing we weren't that short of was ammunition. And so what we were able to do is actually play around with, things that would have been difficult to do in Canada. So section level attacks or section level fire missions on, fairly rudimentary sites that were there, but still enabled us to go through, coordinating the company level mortars, company level machine guns with our own platoon level stuff to actually go through synchronizing all that stuff, live fire though, and then doing rudimentary close quarter battles, but still going through our drills and being able to execute that. It was really good training. And then of course, what Tarnak Farms, I think, has become known for, what had happened was, as things became more, not certain, but more established within Afghanistan. So the airfield was protected, and I think it was very well, after a month or two, it was pretty well established that there wasn't going to be any Taliban assault on Kandahar Airfield. And this is post-op Medusa as well. There became a task in eastern Afghanistan. So on coast, I think there was a special forces detachment that was operating out of a safe house in coast and needed basically some security for the base that they were operating in. So there was a company task that was that fell to our battalion to go in and provide security for this special forces detachment, an ODA. So our company was doing that, and as part of that, we, were going through some additional training. We had received night vision optics for our anti-armor weapons, so for the Carl G, and also we had received Mark 19, so the grenade, the automatic grenade launcher, or we had the personnel one, so still like a section or a squad weapon,
okay,
as opposed to the vehicle mounted one,
right.
So we were learning how to use that weapon because we'd never seen it before. Anyway, so we ended up at Tarnak Farms one night to do a night firing range, with, primarily it was, I think, to work on our night optics with our anti-armor weapons, but we also were taking it as an opportunity to, again, just do some training with the sections and the people. So what we had done that night, we had set it up. We did some night CQB, and then we had set it up so that each section commander was going to go through a platoon static range, but with the platoon weapons that attached. And it was really an opportunity for them to, have some additional resources attached to them and see how they perform. What had happened that night was, because we had the Mark 19, my platoon warrant stayed back in camp to brush up on the Mark 19, because he was going to be instructing a class the next day to everybody in terms of how do we use this thing. So he stayed on camp, and so I went, and then it was the 3 section commanders. And Kevin, what he had told me kind of before we left was we'd had an issue doing ranges before where guys weren't restocking with the same amount of ammunition that they had on the range. So they'd come in with whatever their allocation was, and they wouldn't bomb up to the same amount. So they'd be short a mag or something like that.
Okay. When they went back to CAF, they'd be short, light. They'd be light. Okay.
Yeah, you go to the range and you fire off 10 mags and only take like 8 worth or whatever back or something. So I know we'd been having that problem, and it sounds dumb, but these are the kind of real problems that the platoons sometimes have, right? So Kevin, before we left, the last thing he said to me, I think, was he's like, "Sir, make sure those sections get their ammo and are rebombed and come back with everything they're supposed to have." So I'm like, okay, that's fine. I'm like, I got it. This is easy. So we went and we did our ranges, our CQB lanes that we did. And then we had moved into this section range, and we had one section. So mine was the second platoon to go. So it was it would have been 9 serials. The first platoon ran through its 3 serials. Then it was my platoon. We did 1 serial, and then I walked out with the section to the firing line, which is in a wadi, on the edge of a wadi, and then we walked back to the admin area to get the second section to walk up. And instead of walking back out to the firing line with the second section, I stayed in the admin area to make sure that the first section that had just fired got all their ammunition and were being fully restocked with what they needed. And in the interim, while I was doing that, with the CQ, obviously, I missed the second section that had gone up. And because it was nighttime, we're a live fire range, I'm like, I'm not going to walk up on them in the middle of the night. I'll walk off to the side of I'm going to walk off to the side of the range, and if everything's fine there, I'll kind of link up with them there. But I'm not just going to come up with them, while they've already gone off and they're shooting. And so when I did that, I walked off, for a little bit, and then maybe I guess it would have been like maybe 100, maybe 150, maybe 100, 150 meters or so away from where they were. I ended up meeting like one of our pioneers who was attached to us, and we were just having just a range conversation. It was a really nice night. It was April, so it wasn't super hot. Like, we know Afghanistan in the summer gets brutally hot or whatever like that, but it was just a really nice night. And we were just, shooting the breeze or whatever like that. And I think we had just kind of finished our conversation, and I was kind of getting ready to move up and see where the firing was going on. And that's when we saw this, fireball on the firing line where the guys had been shooting. And I remember, like, my initial thoughts were just really confusion, because it didn't make any sense. It didn't make any sense why, what that was, or what could have caused this massive explosion that was on the firing line. It was like, I don't know. I don't think it didn't occur to me. I know the one of the gunners on the Carl G told me afterwards that his immediate thought was that they'd had a misfire and that the misfire had exploded, and that's what it was. And that thought never occurred to me. And I don't know if it's just because I didn't assume that was a possibility or not. It was just very foreign. Mm-hmm. And it was just not, I couldn't even place it or figure out what it was. And I think after, me and the pioneer that I've been talking to, we both kind of dropped to the ground or whatever like that. And then we stayed there for a bit, and we're sort of like processing what had happened. And then, and then obviously you started to hear the cries, and like the shouts and stuff like that. And then, I just ran to the location where everybody was. And it's just utter chaos kind of thing. In terms of, in terms of what we found, obviously, like, the results of dropping a 500-pound bomb on a section and the weapons that are about probably what you would expect. But if anything, the kill radius on that bomb is much bigger. Like, the admin area of the company was within the kill radius, not the kill radius, but certainly the danger area of that bomb. And I think there was only a couple guys that ended up catching shrapnel back in the admin area, just because, in a respect, fortunately, the bomb hit on the side of the wadi, and a lot of the blast was either generated forward away or down into the wadi itself. So, clearly super traumatic, but with the potential to be a lot worse. And then, and so then it really just kind of became, responding to the tragedy in terms of trying to figure out, where is everybody? Do we have everybody? And who can we help, and who can we get out?
How many times did you go back to Afghanistan after that initial Apollo mission? So
I served 4 more tours in Afghanistan after that, and then a number of. That was after that tour in 2001. Then I joined CANSOFCOM, and my tours after that were with CANSOFCOM. Not all of them were 6 months. Like, I had a 3-month tour and a 5-month tour or whatever in there. And then I had a number of smaller, let's call them like security visits, like, for a week or 2 weeks or whatever like that, just for really small instances, like doing close protection for a VIP type of thing. But yeah, so I still deployed like 4 more times to Afghanistan after that.
How did each one of those missions build off each other in terms of your view of whether it be violence and conflict writ large, whether it be Afghanistan itself? I mean, how did your thinking progress? You've got a pretty learned lens on what we did in Afghanistan. So, like, how did it evolve? Did it evolve, and how did that inform your future?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely. Wow, that's a great. We almost talk this whole thing just on that, right? Like, so it did evolve. There's a number of factors it's important to call out, though, at the same time too. When I went back in 2005, it was so we know that after 2001 and 2002, the initial assaults, things kind of, there was like this false sort of like security time where it was like the Oslo Accords happened and Karzai's government was in power, and it was generally tracking along sort of well. We had the mission in Kabul, which Canada wasn't a part of initially. But we know now, we know, and some people knew at the time too, that it wasn't really all that good, right? So when we went back in 2005, there was, what we were being told was that it was that, that's the first time I'd heard of an insurgency, and counterinsurgency. That's what the special forces, the American special forces guys were telling us on the ground. There's this insurgency going on, especially in the south. Kabul was a little bit more stable, which was where the predominance of Western forces were. There was really no development of Afghan forces at that time. When I was there in 2006 in Kandahar, that was the weird rotation. Colonel Hopes, and I don't mean weird, but I mean in the sense that at the start of that rotation, they were driving around in G-Wagons and, waving to people and handing out water bottles. And by the end of that rotation, they were getting bombed in Panjwai. And, Panjwai was basically a hardened military defensive area. And, that obviously didn't happen just in six months, but it was starkly evident, from that period. And even it was it was surreal in 2006 when we were there, based at an operating base closer to Kandahar City, that we were legitimately talking about the Taliban assaulting Kandahar City and whether or not, our FOBs were defensible. Mm-hmm. And it was very surreal. And then, when I went back in 2008, that was the surge. I think the surge had not quite happened. If I'm not mistaken, it was just after that it was authorized. But certainly, Canada had gone in with a lot heavier forces, so the tanks were on the ground. But we were taking heavy IED casualties during that time, so that was different. That was different again. And then in 2011, when I was there, that's when the Canadian combat mission was standing down. The surge was happening. And it was it was a lot different in terms of focus. And, General Petraeus was controlling the map in terms of synchronizing all forces. I mean, not personally, but obviously, there. One of the evolutions I think that I saw was at the start, it was sort of like every country for themselves kind of thing, Canada ended up having RAO, and although the Brits, we didn't, the UK, we didn't work with them close. They weren't involved in Helmand at that time, but certainly a lot of the national contingents had like, hey, this is our campaign plan for wherever, our geographic location, and this is what we're going to accomplish. And it wasn't necessarily synced with, someone else working in potentially the same space. Yeah. And people working in the same space weren't necessarily synced. And I know, that one of the dynamics between SOF and the conventional force was that it often, weren't synced efforts. It was actions that were happening and not necessarily, coordinated. At best, it was sort of like deconflicted. And that progressed, that steadily progressed till by the end in 2011 when I was there. It was it was not harmonized, let's say, but everyone did seem to be working towards a common goal. There was clearly, the area commanders were in charge of, not the area, but the division commanders, in charge of RC South. They were in charge of what was going on there, and everything had to sync with it, even within the Canadian effort, we were very much more aligned with the Joint Task Force headquarters. It was there. I know I was essentially, as the SOF Task Force commander, I was essentially General Milner's SOF advisor at the same time that I was, the Task Force commander for Canadian SOF in it. So making sure that our efforts reinforced higher commander's intent and, and above that. And then also that it was harmonized with what the SOF intent was overall. But, by then, the writing was kind of on the wall. I think we, the surge already had an end date, and I think it was widely known, or at least discussed, that the Taliban were effectively kind of slow rolling, essentially waiting out Western forces because some of the dates of drawdowns had already been announced. I mean, we were drawing down. Yeah, so you see this kind of like, well, really, I mean, let's call it what it is, incoherence at the start of it. In terms of a bunch of organizations doing their own thing in the battle space. And not to say that it's not just the military too, but being asked to do things that aren't typically within the sphere of the military, right? Like between aid organizations and governance. I mean, we had the team supporting the government in Kabul, but
the SAT,
exactly. Yeah.
Strategic
advisor team. It was, yeah. I mean, an incredibly complex space. Like, there's no like single easy reason why it fell apart. But if there was, we would have fixed it, right? But there's a lot of reasons why it came apart. But this incoherence at the start, though, to something that did make sense at the end. But by then, we'd kind of lost, certainly lost some of the narrative a little bit in terms of what was going on.
When was the writing on the wall for you to say that, I need to do something differently, still in the military, but...
Yeah. I mean, something like that doesn't happen overnight. So there's a few things that kind of, the scale of me deciding to do something differently, and they all ended up being like little pebbles on that scale, weighing it down, right? Part of it was definitely my last my tour when I was there as a task force commander provided a bit of that, because you start to see some of the inconsistencies in the strategy, right? Like our means of, our processing of detainees. So, and this is, essentially just Kill Cullen's idea of the accidental guerrilla kind of thing, right? Where we pick up people on a raid with good intelligence, and we detain them, and they enter the Afghan detention system, through our through our appropriate transfer mechanisms, and they end up in the detention system, and then become radicalized in the detention system, and come out, and then also, so not only are we potentially creating more people through that, but then also, the people from a tribal perspective who are annoyed at us, and annoyed probably isn't the strongest word to use there, but who basically now have a beef with us as well. So we had an instance on my tour where, oh God, what was the prison outside of Kandahar City? Anyway, so this prison, which is outside Kandahar City, they had a classic prison break. The Taliban dug a tunnel underneath the prison, and thousands of detained people escaped. So we were, for like a week after that, we were doing operations to try to round up these prisoners. And we got some intelligence. We got some intelligence on a compound just south of Kandahar City, and we rolled up and had what we thought was good interaction with the people, and then the battle space owner were like, yeah, these guys are definitely not from around here anyway. So we removed some people that we thought were detainees, and then the next day the elders were super upset with us. And it was very much like that was a question where I'm like, maybe we're creating more harm than good here. Like, I don't know that we're actually making things better anymore. And we were 100% well-intentioned. Like, there was nothing, the intelligence was sound. We had multiple points of corroborating intelligence from multiple different sources. But then there's all these other things that play into it, right? Like the battle space owner and their understanding of people that were going on, potentially, the motivations of some of those intelligence sources, and whether there was like a tribal rivalry or whatnot. So that was one incident, and there was a few things on that tour that kind of caused me to think, what are we doing? What are we doing? What are we doing? So someone else had said to me, before I went, and I think it was meant in a a sort of like well-intentioned advice, that nothing that we did in Afghanistan was worth the life of a single Canadian soldier, kind of thing. And I was sort of like, well, what? What are we doing there then? Like, that's our job. That's our job, to be there. And, obviously I'm not going to make decisions to put people into situations where, a cavalier idea towards a risk, but there's we do our best to mitigate risk, but that's part of our job. And we're also fighting a competent adversary there. I mean, if any of us think that the Taliban didn't know their business, like, we're not giving credit to people who live their whole life fighting. Yeah. So they didn't have many of the advantages we did, but they still did pretty well for themselves, So if you're not giving them credit for that, then that's a mistake. But it's like, well, what are we doing here? So those were a couple of the pebbles. Shortly after I came back, I went to JCSP, so the Joint Command and Staff Program in Toronto. And I just remember that being very frustrating.
It's like a year-long master's program sort of thing.
That's right.
Yeah.
I just remember it being very not as advertised. Not as advertised. So right from like an administrative perspective, we made we had looked into moving my family. And by this time, by JCSP, I had a daughter, she was born like basically a month after I came back from my rotation, my tour in Afghanistan. So we had looked into moving to Toronto together, and everything was set up that going separately, like on imposed restrictions, was the way to do it. And I remember my wife talking about it. She's like, well, I thought that people were the priority, she's like, so how is it that the departmental policy is really driving us to set up to a situation where we can't be together? And I didn't have an answer for it. So that started to tune me into some of the say-do gap that exists, especially on, some of the people side of things within the department. And then, some of the things that we studied on the course too were just not, I just come from, almost 8 years of, being very operationally driven, and my time was at a premium. And I felt like my time wasn't being used properly in Toronto, because we were, we would do things that we either already knew I didn't have the best attitude either. Like, I have to, be totally fair on that. Like, the last thing I wanted to kind of do was I wanted to do my business and get back to my family. I didn't want to be going to the mess on a Thursday night or, like, I just wanted to get my work done and take care of business and then get back to my life, because I hadn't had much of one. And I didn't feel like that perspective was reciprocated at Toronto. And also a lot of the people didn't, I don't think had current experience. Like, I remember we were doing a module on targeting, and it ended up being me and a Marine officer that led the syndicate. We led the module on targeting because I had actually completed strategic targeting. Like, I'd been doing that since I was almost a captain in 2005, like contributing to strategic targeting decisions. And then as a task force commander, I was advising the JTF commander in terms of targets that we were going to be prosecuting. So I was pretty well familiar with it, although with no formal training, but I was, kind of underwhelmed with some of the things that we were talking about also. So I kind of walked away from that a bit sour, and then I was in Chief of Force Development. I was the Chief of Force Development's staff officer or executive assistant, kind of doing both things. And that was, on the one hand, a wonderful mentorship opportunity, because I was able to sit in now on a bunch of institutional processes that were going on. So, how does the Canadian military as a whole identify capabilities that we think we need and then prioritize certain ones? And how does the dynamic work with some of these senior governance committees? So I was able to see some of that stuff,
which is very much seen in the military in succession planning as a very good job, a stepping stone to further promotions, better appointments, because you get that exposure and you have that sort of that close relationship with one of these senior leaders. So it's very much a sort of a chapeau to your future.
Yeah. And that was the plan. That was absolutely 100% the plan. And it was very good. And I'm super thankful for those opportunities. And I saw a lot. And Mike Day, who was CFD for the majority of my time there, bent over backwards to bring me in and mentor me on some of that stuff. And I hate to say it too, but at the same time, it's almost like seeing how things work, though, was also a little underwhelming, because I think I had this idea, that, you're going to go up one level and it was all going to make sense, and we tell people that, right? In battalion, as a platoon commander, hey, I get it. It doesn't make sense, but don't worry. The battalion understands what's going on. And then you get to battalion level and they're like, don't worry. The brigade has a plan. And you keep working your way up and you keep expecting, well, at the strategic level, they know what's going on. And then you see it and it's like, hey, this is a multi-year capability we're trying to procure here. And this guy just submarined it after like seeing the issue for an afternoon or something like that. And you're like, is that really how we make decisions here? So on the one hand, there was like exposure to like really good, fascinating stuff. And then you see the normal things, like in NDHQ where, the tumbleweeds are rolling through the cubicles at 2:00 in the afternoon kind of thing. It's like, I don't know that we're all in it to win it here. Yeah. And I'm just like, and that's fine. Everyone's in a different point in their life. But the cumulative effect of that was that all these things were like little rocks in my shoe, and they started to add up, and I started to become and other minor irritances that were in this as well, like the commute, the commute to downtown or to Startop and sitting in traffic for an hour a day, where you just like think about this stuff, and it just started to add up, and like I didn't realize it, but I was starting to become very angry. Like I'd lose my temper, often, and not like in inappropriate ways or whatever like that. But I remember coming one home and I was just like, I got home and I was like complaining about the commute home because I've been stuck in traffic, and my wife's like, stop. She's like, there's something going on with you and you need to sort it out. Because this is no attitude. Like this is no attitude for us to go forward with. Like there's an issue that's making you angry and you got to deal with it. That coincided, through happenstance with my wife being pregnant with our second child. And throughout that pregnancy, my not my boss, but the chief of staff at Chief of Force Development, Dan Bouchard, had said, like, you need to go on parental leave. Just like take it. It's a good opportunity because there's nothing at CFD, that, you can take it. It's a good opportunity to do it. And I really militated against that because it just was super foreign to me, the idea that I would go off for 6 or 7 months and with my child. Like I couldn't grasp it. But when I was sort of confronted with this with my wife, then I was like, I'm going to do it. Yeah. Cause I think that there's something that's going on here, and I need to kind of take a moment and consolidate, I guess, if I can use a military term for it, and figure out what's going on. So I did take it. And then, that ended up just being like a transformative event in my life. Because really she was off as well. So it was just, the four of us off for a little bit. And I actually made an effort to really take stock of where I was in life. And we came up with like this really good schedule. So we weren't working all the time, like between two kids, like between two adults. I mean, if you're willing to share responsibilities and stuff like that, you can still balance things. And they were both pretty young. So we had some time to ourselves. And like one of the things I discovered was that I didn't know what to do with myself. Like, I didn't have any hobbies. Like there was stuff that I did now and then, like I was doing triathlon, but that was sort of self-serving anyways, because we're supposed to be fit and in shape. And so it wasn't like, I didn't want to say it was a hobby because I wasn't necessarily passionate about it. It wasn't something that I did just for me. It was something that I did to be in shape, and like it was interesting. And don't get me wrong, like it was fun too, but
it wasn't really distinct from the profession. Yeah,
exactly. It wasn't distinct from the profession,
right?
100%. Yeah. So that's when I decided to start creative writing, which was, I don't know what it was about writing specifically, but my wife's family is very artistic and creative. She has a number of singers in her family, like professional musicians, and her dad writes poetry, etc. So I don't know if that guided me or whatever. Anyways, I took a course through Algonquin College, a distance learning course on, basics of creative writing kind of thing. And I started to get into it, and like I started to enjoy it.
What was your undergrad degree in?
So my degree was in politics and economics. It was back when I did my degree, it was a split one because neither department was really big enough to offer their own distinct one. So it was a bachelor's in politics and economics.
So this is your first real exposure to like proper creative writing.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And on top of that, I'd done, by this point I had a master's in defense studies and in public administration, but all very academic stuff. Mm-hmm. So creative writing now, like a very different beast. So then I started to get into it and started to enjoy it. And then just one thing, this would have been kind of October-ish or whatever I started with it. And then November is National Novel Writing Month, which is a challenge to write 50,000 words. A novel, you could use quotation marks around novel, or is really to write a story, which is 50,000 words long. And it seemed like a good, thing to try. I was all about, like taking on hard things. I could totally do this. So like I did it. Like I had through working on this creative writing course, I had the seed of an idea that had struck me as interesting, and then ended up being like the basis of what I wrote for National Novel Writing Month. And then I And then that was sort of the first in a series of milestones that happened to me where it was like, I finished one thing and it's like, okay, well, what do I do now? So I made it to the end of National Novel Writing Month. I had a 50,000-ish story, which was horrible. It's like really terrible. But then it's like, well, what do I do with it now? I can either put it away or work on it and try to make it better. And so that's what I did. I edited a few more, and I took a few more courses, obviously, and try to figure out, hey, it started to become really obvious to me that I didn't know what I was doing. So anyways, for basically that, by the end of my parental leave, I guess, and when it was time to go back to work, I'd really kind of transform myself in terms of like, hey, like I really enjoy writing and telling stories, and there's a lot that I don't know about it. And I had the basis of a book that I thought I could do something with. And then I went back to work, and I think the plan for me going back to work was I had a 3-week or a month that I needed to finish up at CFD. And while I was doing that, I was going to be doing a handover with my next position, which was to be the J3 or the director of operations at Kansofcom headquarters. So I did that. I did my handover. I took over as J3. And even at that point, I was still like, I'd known that things had changed for me, but I still had an idea that, I could do this job. And then exactly as you said, with the SO job leading into a J3 job, like that's setting me on a certain trajectory that would, see me be, go into future high profile positions. And I think it was like a week after I was at J3, I just woke up one day and I'm like, I can't do this anymore. Like I just didn't have the drive to,
Happened that quickly.
When the tipping point finally came,
yeah.
It was pretty quick. I just I can't imagine doing this for, the next 5 years. I can't imagine, at that point I was well back into the routine. It's that's clearly a high profile in a high demand job. I was leaving before everyone was up in the morning and kind of getting back as my daughters were going to bed. So it was kind of like being deployed in Canada because I didn't really see my family ever. And I didn't have it the worst either. Like there's other people who were working harder than me. But at the same time too, I'm like, I just, is this worth the sacrifice that I'm making right now? Because, at that time, at the time, one of the things that we were dealing with when I was at J3 was the ISIS in Iraq, and Iraq had fallen, right? And Syria had fallen, and we were supporting the Kurds on the line. And it was kind of like, and then you start to pull on the threads, and you're like, holy shit! Like we kind of, not we as in you and me, but we kind of created this in a way. So is that what it's going to be like? Is that what it's going to be like for the next 5 years? Like I'm going to be, or the next 10 or however many years it's going to be? Like I'm going to do something and create a mess that I'm going to have to go in and sort out, 5 or 10 years later because we didn't take a moment to think through the long-term consequences of our actions. And it was just kind of like, and what's the skin in the game for us back here, really? Because at that point, there was a lot of national support for Afghanistan when we were in it. And I don't think that was the case. How many people even know that we have forces in Iraq right now? I'd say far fewer than, we're tracking the Afghanistan mission.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
And is that, do I want to know my family through pictures attached to emails for this? And I couldn't come up with, a really solid answer that let me look at myself in the mirror and go like, this is totally worth it. And so that led me to, I'm like, I gotta do something different. And so, that's when I, signaled to my, the folks managing my career that I needed to have a different path and, where I'd have, some time to kind of figure stuff out for myself and go on a different journey. So, and then kind of spent a year sort of figuring that out and then was able to do that.
I'm conscious of time because I know you're going to have to go pick up your daughter, but I do want to talk a little bit about the Spark. You've written a couple of books though before the Spark that are fiction, but the Spark's really not.
No, the Spark is totally nonfiction.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So how did that come into being, and why did you feel that you're dedicating that chunk of your bandwidth to the Spark was important?
Well, I didn't want to write it. So after I wrote my first novel, and I think after I gave my first TED talk, I was approached by a friend that I work with in CanSoftCom, and he's kind of like, he pitched me on the idea of collaboratively writing a leadership book, and I wasn't really that interested. I was really tepid on the idea because I just think that it's a crowded space in terms of military people writing leadership books, and also soft people writing soft leadership books or whatever like that. And also I didn't think that I had anything new to offer on that one. So I was really tepid on it, but I agreed because he was a friend. I agreed to kind of sound out the idea and just kind of work with him on it. And through a period of discussion, we came up with a different question, which was a lot more interesting to me. And so one day we were talking, and I can't remember which one of us asked it, but the idea that came up was like, if you knew that you weren't going to have a chance to talk to your kids about what it meant to be a good citizen, what would you tell them? Say you were able to write a letter to them. What would you tell them in that letter about what it means to be a good citizen? Knowing that you would never have a chance to tell them again. And then that was of interest to me through a number of different things. Like, it's cliche to say it, but having kids does change your perspective a little bit, right? Because now that's a factor when I make decisions. It's how do I put things in place for them? How do I help make them be better than the person I am or was? Because they might be interacting with a world that's more challenging than us. How do I make sure that they're prepared for it? So that was more interesting. So we sounded that out, and we had like a really rough template for it. And some of the template was no good. Like, I had this initial idea. What we wanted to do was make it like, in a kung fu movie where someone shows up at the master's place and they're like, I want to train. And then the master's like, go away, you're not good enough. And then there's this period of where they have to kind of make their, like, show that they're good enough.
Prove they're worthy.
Yeah, we wanted to do the literary equivalent of doing that. And it could work, but I don't know that it was right anyway. So, and then like this ended up being like a really long period. And my friend, writing a book is tough. It takes a long time to do it. And my friend had other stuff that he needed to focus on. So we kind of separated and went our own ways on the book, and not in a contentious way by any means, but just because, life got in the way. And I kept sort of chipping away at it because I couldn't let it go. It was one of those things like, having started something now, I can't, I got to so it was this exact same thing with my other books. I got to a certain point, I got to a first draft. I'm like, what do I do with it now? I'm like, I can put it away. And it just felt like a big shame to put all this work away. So I'm like, well, I'll edit it again and I'll see if I can get further with it. And I kept taking it further and further. And then I eventually got to a point where I didn't know enough on my own on what I could do next. So I got with an editor. And then the editor, one of the things that the editor told me was, so by this time it had morphed. Well, it was a citizenship book. And the premise of it was roughly similar to what it is right now. Society's facing a number of challenges. The answer to that is civic engagement and people, committing to service to others or putting others ahead of themselves and the greater good. And she's like, well, you've identified a number of different challenges that are here. And she's like, but not in great amount of detail. And she's like, you can either focus in on, exploring that or dial in on one specific challenge. And she said, climate comes up a lot in it. And she said, that is certainly something that's happening. So either approach is good, like focus in on one specific one, such as, how civic participation could help society become more resilient for climate change, or for things in general. And so I chose to go with the climate portion, partly because it's frankly easier, because there's a lot of research out there, and it seemed, a bit of laziness on my part, but it seemed like the easier thing to do from a writer's perspective was to make that argument. And then I was able to get the Spark to where it is, well, close to where it is right now. But like a funny thing happened while I was writing it, because we were initially, we had this book, which was for this nebulous audience of, military-like people. And then we threw that away pretty quickly. And then it was like, okay, well, it's for young adults, really. It's like, not my daughters now, because they're a little too young for the content, but, when they're teenagers or, they're in high school and potentially early university, this is the right place for them. And some of the content is really tough, but I say this a number of times, and we're not going to pull any punches. And I think people can handle harsh realities if it's done in a respectful, sensitive way, because that's how the world works. But the funny thing that happened was that at some point, the audience narrowed down to me. It ended up to being about me. And so in this weird circumstance where I'm writing on my own experience, but it ends up being this like kind of ongoing muse, I guess, with myself about what it means to be a good citizen. And that doesn't mean that the other audience, being for my kids is not relevant or not, but it does add a dynamic that I hadn't thought of before. And I think it explains a little bit. I've had a lot of like feedback from, people with similar backgrounds to me, like people I've served with who've said that they really appreciate it. I had one guy write that it's almost like a voice that he wished he could be able to. He's like, this is our voice. He's like, I wish I could be able to. He's like, you're saying stuff that all of us are thinking. And that wasn't my intent. But I think in the process of kind of like the audience coming on me, that may have been something that came out in the wash, I guess. It's one of those fortuitous, lucky circumstances that happen, which you can't even really plan for. It's something that happens and you just, if that's the case, I could be wrong, but.
Al, this has been a great conversation, and I'm going to ask you the last question. Now I ask everyone if you have a recommendation to the listener that will either educate, entertain, or elevate a cause that's important to you.
I think what I would do, and no surprise here as an author that I'm going to recommend a book, but Katharine Hayhoe is a climate scientist, and she wrote a book called Saving Us. And it's a really fascinating viewpoint. And it ties into some of the things that we've been talking about in terms of service. How service may involve just having a conversation with somebody. And she has, a lot of great insights as a climate scientist, is at the forefront of, denialism and skepticism, a lot of which is not respectful or civil. And so, she has a lot of experience kind of interacting in this space, and also with people with motivated reasoning, and has a lot of insight in terms of how something can be meaningful for you and push it. And just how, like having a conversation with somebody may be enough to serve a greater good, because it gets people talking about an issue that's important. And, particularly in our day and age, there is a lot of misinformation and disinformation on that. And sometimes the views that we hold, we might be scared of having some sort of conflict, and so never call each other out on each other's views, knowing that we can do it in a respectful manner. And her book offers like a number of different suggestions and solutions about how things aren't that dire, if we're able to work together. And one of the ways that we can work together is being able to talk to each other and doing so in a respectful manner, and while being committed to trying to see issues from someone else's perspective. So yeah, Katharine Hayhoe's book, Saving Us, is a great read.
Awesome. Hey, Alastair, thanks again for being on the podcast, and appreciate your time today.
No, thank you very much. Yeah, thank you.
You can find information in the show notes on the Volga Germans, the Tarnak Farm tragedy, the Saraposa prison break in Afghanistan, Alastair's works of fiction, and the Spark on Substack. Thanks for listening to the NSP. Goodbye until next time.